Be me, 63 years old, sitting in my downtown apartment on a Friday night with a glass of wine that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a week. Looking out at the city lights, thinking about how I got here. To this specific moment, this specific emptiness. Successful career, corner office for 15 years before I took early retirement, investment portfolio that would make most men weep with envy. But the apartment is silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car horn from the street below. No one is coming over tonight. No one called today except my financial advisor. No one will be here tomorrow morning. Need to write this down. Need to figure out where it all went sideways. Let me start at the beginning, or at least where I think the beginning was. 1982, fresh out of college with my economics degree, 22 years old, and ready to burn down every barrier that stood between me and the life I deserved. Got hired at Morrison Financial Group as a junior analyst, one of 3 women in a department of 47 people. The other 2 women were secretaries who brought coffee and filed papers, while the men made decisions and money. I was different though. I had fought my way into the actual analysis department, into the room where it happened. My first day, this guy named Robert from the derivatives desk came over to introduce himself. He was maybe 28, had this easy confidence that came from never having had to justify his existence in a professional space. Tall, decent looking, expensive suit that probably cost a month of my salary. "Welcome aboard," he said, extending his hand. "If you need anyone to show you the ropes, I'm happy to help. It can be intimidating at first." I remember feeling this flash of anger, this immediate assumption that I would need help, that I would be intimidated. "I'm sure I'll manage," I told him, shaking his hand firmly, making sure my grip matched his. "I didn't graduate top of my class to need my hand held." He pulled back slightly, smile flickering. "Of course, just being friendly." "I'm here to work, not make friends," I said, and turned back to my desk. Felt proud of myself for establishing boundaries immediately, for not falling into the trap of being the nice girl who smiles and defers. My cubicle neighbor, Janet, one of the secretaries, had watched the whole exchange. She came by later with some files and said quietly, "Robert's actually very nice, you know. His sister works in accounting. He helps a lot of the new people, men and women." "I don't need his help," I said, not looking up from my work. "That's how it starts. They help you, then they take credit for your success." Janet just nodded and walked away, and I felt satisfied that I had made my position clear. The first few months were brutal, not going to lie. The men would go to lunch together and not invite me, would have conversations about deals and strategies that I wasn't part of, but I told myself this was the price of refusing to play their game, of not being the girl who giggles at their jokes and makes herself smaller to fit in. I worked harder than anyone, stayed later, came in earlier, made sure my analysis was flawless. My boss, Edward, was in his 50s, old school, barely looked at me during meetings. 6 months in, I completed this analysis of emerging markets that predicted a major shift in currency valuations. It was brilliant work, genuinely brilliant, and I knew it. I presented it at the department meeting, laid out all my research, my projections, my recommendations. Edward listened, nodded occasionally, said "interesting" a few times. Then Robert raised his hand and asked some questions about my methodology, wanted to know more about specific data points. I answered them all perfectly, had anticipated every possible challenge. But then Edward said, "Robert, why don't you work with her to refine this into something we can? Present to the executive team?" Felt like a punch to the stomach. Work with him? Why? My analysis was complete. It didn't need refining, it needed to be implemented. "I don't think that's necessary," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "The analysis is comprehensive as presented." Edward gave me this look, this tired look, like I was being difficult. "Nevertheless, I'd like Robert to review it with you. 2 heads are better than 1. Wanted to scream that my one head had done just fine, that this was exactly the kind of undermining I had been warned about. But I needed this job, needed to prove myself, so I said fine. Robert came by my desk that afternoon with a legal pad and that same friendly smile. "So I read through your analysis again," he said, pulling up a chair. "It's really solid work. I especially liked your approach to the Brazilian real projections." I waited for the but, for the criticism, for him to start picking it apart so he could rebuild it with his name. It's attached. "I think if we present this to the executive team, we should lead with the currency correlation matrices rather than the historical overview," he continued. "They tend to lose patience with background. Hit them with the stunning conclusion first, then support it." He was right, annoyingly right. That was a better presentation strategy. "Fine," I said. I'll restructure it. Great, he said, standing up. Also, just so you know, I'm going to tell Edward this was entirely your analysis and I'm just helping with presentation format. Want to make sure you get full credit. Didn't know what to do with that. Didn't fit the narrative I had constructed. Okay, I said, and he walked away. We presented it 2 weeks later. I led the presentation with Robert beside me to answer technical questions. The executive team loved it, implemented the recommendations, made the firm a substantial profit over the next quarter. Edward called me into his office afterward and told me I had done excellent work. Robert speaks very highly of you, he added. Says you're one of the sharpest analysts he's worked with. Should have felt good, should have felt vindicated, but instead I felt angry, felt like Robert's endorsement was what had actually mattered, not my work itself. Told myself that this proved my point, that a man's word carried more weight than a woman's accomplishments. Over the next few years, I built a reputation for being extremely competent but difficult to work with. I never went to the office happy hours, never participated in the softball team, never joined the conversations about families and weekends. Kept everything professional, kept my distance, made sure no one could accuse me of sleeping my way to success or being promoted because I was likable. The promotions came anyway because I was that good. My analysis was always thorough, my recommendations consistently profitable. By 1987, I was a senior analyst. By 1990, I was a department head. But I had no friends in the office, no allies, no one who would grab coffee with me or ask how my weekend was. Told myself I didn't need that I was there to work and build a career, not to be popular. My mother would call and ask if I was seeing anyone, if there were any nice men at work. I'm not interested in meeting men at work, I would tell her. I'm there to do my job, not find a husband. You can do both, sweetheart, she would say in that patient tone that made me want to throw the phone across the room. Why would I want to? So I can end up like you, brilliant and educated, but spending your life cooking dinner for a man who thinks his career is more important than yours. She would go quiet when I said things like that, and I would feel guilty, but also righteous. My father was a professor. My mother had a master's degree in literature, but had stayed home to raise me and my brother. I had watched her intelligence go unused, watched her accommodate and adjust and make herself smaller. I was determined not to repeat her mistakes. There was this guy named Marcus who started in 1991, around the time I became department head. He was different from the other men in the office, had this quiet intensity, read philosophy books at his desk during lunch. He would sometimes ask me questions that weren't about work, would want to know what I thought about things happening in the world. I was careful with him, kept my answers brief and professional, didn't let myself get drawn in. One time he asked me if I wanted to get dinner sometime, said there was this new Ethiopian restaurant he wanted to try. I don't date people from work, I told him immediately. It's unprofessional and creates conflicts of interest. It's just dinner, he said, looking genuinely confused. I wasn't proposing marriage. It's never just dinner, I said. It's how it starts. Then there are expectations. Then your career gets tangled up with personal, relationships and everything becomes complicated. He nodded slowly, said, I understand, and never asked again. Continued to be friendly though, would still chat with me about books and ideas, never made it weird. Part of me wondered if I had made a mistake, if maybe dinner would have been just dinner. But I had seen too many women in the office whose careers had been derailed by relationships, who had been seen as someone's girlfriend instead of as professionals in their own right. Better to be alone and respected than attached and diminished. 1995. I got promoted to VP corner office, salary that made my father whistle when I told him. I was 42 years old, at the peak of my career, and I had done it all myself without compromising. That same year, my brother got married to this woman named Sarah, who worked part-time at a bookstore and spent most of her energy planning the wedding. At the reception, my aunt pulled me aside and asked in this pitying voice when I was going to settle down. I am settled, I told her. I have a career that I love and a life that I've built on my terms. But don't you want a family? Children? She pressed. Why would I want to give up everything I've worked for to change diapers and lose myself in someone else's needs? She looked at me like I had said something horrible, like I had violated some sacred principle. My mother overheard and came over, touched my arm gently. Not everyone wants the same things, and that's okay. She was defending me, but I could see the sadness in her eyes, the worry. It made me furious, this assumption that something was wrong with me because I had chosen differently. The late 90s were my best years professionally. I was managing a team of 30, making strategic decisions that affected billions in assets, getting headhunted by other firms regularly. but I had also developed a reputation in the industry as someone who was brilliant but cold, someone you worked with out of necessity rather than choice. My team respected me but didn't like me. I knew that. I had one guy who worked for me, named David, who was incredibly talented but would sometimes push back on my directives. Once I had outlined a strategy for a particular investment and he had suggested an alternative approach. I appreciate your input, I told him in front of the whole team, but I've been doing this for 20 years and I know what works. We'll proceed with my recommendation. His face had flushed and he had nodded, said, "Of course." But I could see the resentment. 2 weeks later, my strategy had failed spectacularly. We lost a significant amount of money, and his suggested approach would have avoided the whole thing. He never said I told you so, but he didn't have to. I called him into my office and told him his analysis had been correct and I should have listened. Thought that would be enough, that acknowledging the error would smooth things over. But he just nodded and said, "Thank you for saying that." In this flat tone that suggested it didn't actually matter, he left for another firm 6 months later, and I told myself it was about money or opportunity, not about my management style. But I knew, deep down, that I had created an environment where talented people didn't want to stay. 2003, I turned 50, and something shifted. Started noticing that the younger women coming into the firm were different from me. They were ambitious, yes, but they also laughed with their colleagues, went to happy hours, had work friends they genuinely cared about. One of them, a brilliant analyst named Rachel, got promoted rapidly and seemed to do it without making enemies. She worked with the men in the office easily, collaborated rather than competed, and somehow maintained her authority without the constant vigilance I had always employed. I watched her one day in a meeting, the way she disagreed with a male colleague's point, but did it with this light touch, made it about the idea rather than about territory. The colleague actually thanked her for the perspective and adjusted his recommendation. When had I ever had an exchange like that? When had I ever disagreed with someone and had them thank me? Started to wonder if maybe I had been wrong about some things, if maybe my approach had been more costly than necessary. But I was 50 years old, my patterns were set, my reputation established. Couldn't suddenly become warm and collaborative, would seem fake, desperate. So I continued as I had always been, and tried not to think about the loneliness that was starting to feel less like a noble sacrifice and more like a mistake. That same year, Robert, remember him from my first day, got promoted to CFO. We had worked together off and on for 2 decades by that point, always professionally, always cordially. He had gotten married in the mid-80s, had 3 kids, seemed happy in this uncomplicated way that I had always slightly scorned. He called me into his office one day and told me the firm was restructuring, that they wanted to offer me an early retirement package. "You've given us incredible years of service," he said, and he sounded genuine. "This would be a very generous package, would set you up comfortably." Felt like the floor had dropped out. "I'm 50, I said. "I'm not ready to retire." "I know," he said, and he looked uncomfortable. "But the firm is going in a different direction, wants different leadership styles. This is the best option we can offer." Different leadership styles? That was the knife. I had been too rigid, too isolated, too unable to build the kinds of relationships that make someone indispensable. "What if I don't accept?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Then we'll have to have different conversations about your position," he said quietly. "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." I took the package, signed the papers, cleaned out my office over a weekend, so I wouldn't have to see anyone. 21 years at that firm, and I left with a banker's box of personal items and no one to say goodbye to. The retirement package was generous. He hadn't lied about that. But I was 50 years old and suddenly had nothing to do with my days. Tried to tell myself this was freedom, this was the reward for all my hard work. Could travel, could pursue hobbies, could live on my own terms. But every time I thought about traveling alone or taking up painting or whatever people do in retirement, I felt this crushing emptiness. My mother had died 2 years earlier, my father was in a nursing home and barely recognized me. My brother had his family, his children who were teenagers by then, his wife who had always been polite but distant with me. I had acquaintances, professional connections, people I could call for lunch if I wanted to network. But no friends, not really. No one who knew me beyond my professional accomplishments. Started thinking about choices I had made, the framework I had used to navigate my life. Had been so sure that the system was rigged against me, that I had to fight every moment or be crushed. And in some ways I had been right. The early years had been genuinely difficult, genuinely unfair. But had I let that early experience calcify into a permanent defensive posture? What about Robert, who had actually been kind and supportive from the beginning? What about Marcus, who had just wanted to have dinner and talk about ideas? What about David, whose good analysis I had dismissed because I couldn't bear to be challenged? Started to see all these moments where I had assumed the worst, had treated potential allies as enemies, had isolated myself in the name of integrity. Tried dating in my 50s, thought maybe it wasn't too late. Met a few men through various channels, tried to be open. But I had no practice at this, no skill at letting someone in. On one date, a nice man named Thomas, who was a retired engineer, asked me about my hobbies. I realized I didn't have any, had spent 30 years working and nothing else. Told him I liked reading and museums, which was true, but also so generic it said nothing about who I was. He asked what I had read recently, and I blanked. The last book I had read had been a financial analysis text for work. "I've been busy," I said, and he nodded politely, and we both knew there wouldn't be a second date. Tried a few more times over the years, but it was always the same. I didn't know how to be with someone, didn't know how to make space for another person's needs and wants. Had spent so long making sure no one could diminish me that I had made myself impenetrable. By 60, I had stopped trying, lived comfortably on my investments, filled my days with routines and errands and reading the books I had told Thomas I liked, saw my brother's family for holidays, played the role of the successful career woman aunt. His daughter asked me once if I was lonely. She was 23, just out of college, starting her own career. "Sometimes," I told her honestly, "but I made my choices and I don't regret them." She looked at me with this expression I couldn't quite read, something between pity and determination. "I want to have a career and a family," she said. "I don't think you have to choose." "Maybe you don't," I said. "Maybe things are different now." But I wondered if things had ever been as binary as I had made them, if the either-or had been my construction rather than reality. The feminism I had embraced had been about liberation, about having choices, about not being forced into a predetermined role. But somehow, I had taken those ideas and built my own prison with them. Had decided that marriage was submission, that collaboration was weakness, that any form of accommodation was betrayal. Had been so afraid of becoming my mother that I had denied myself the things that had actually made her happy. Because she had been happy, I realized now, looking back honestly, she had loved my father, had loved raising us, had found meaning in her choices even if they hadn't been my choices. I had judged her, had seen her life as wasted, had been so certain I knew better. And now I was 63 years old, sitting alone in my expensive apartment, wondering where all the people had gone. Started writing this all down a few months ago, trying to make sense of it, not for publication or anything, just for myself to understand. The feminist framework I had absorbed in college had taught me to see everything as a power struggle, every interaction as potentially exploitative. Men were the enemy, or at least the opposition, and any woman who didn't see it that way was deluded or complicit. Marriage was patriarchy, family was a trap, collaboration was subjugation. These ideas had felt revolutionary and empowering when I was 22, but I had taken them to such an extreme that I had lost the plot entirely, had protected myself so thoroughly from being used that I had made myself useless for any genuine human connection. Thought about Rachel again, the young woman who had risen through the firm after me. She had gotten married a few years back, had a kid now, was still working and apparently doing it all successfully. How had she managed it? What did she understand that I had missed? Reached out to her through LinkedIn, asked if she wanted to get coffee. She said yes immediately, seemed genuinely pleased to hear from me. We met at this trendy place downtown. She showed up with her daughter in a stroller, looking tired but happy. "How do you do it?" I asked her after we had exchanged pleasantries. "How do you balance everything?" She laughed. "I don't balance it exactly. I just kind of survive it. Some days work suffers, some days parenting suffers. It's messy." "But you make it work," I pressed. "You have both things, career and family." She looked at me thoughtfully. "Can I be honest with you?" I nodded. "When I started at the firm, everyone told me you were this legend, this woman who had broken all the barriers," she said. "But they also said you were—" She paused, choosing words carefully. "That you were very isolated, that you didn't let anyone in." "That's true," I said. "I made a conscious choice not to be that way," she continued. "Not because I judged you, but because I watched my mom try to be superwoman and refuse all help, and it made her miserable. So I asked for help, I collaborated, I let myself be human." "And the men didn't take advantage of that?" I asked. She seemed puzzled by the question. "Some men are jerks, sure. But most people, men and women, are just trying to do their jobs and live their lives. If you assume everyone is out to get you, you create that reality. Sat with that for a while, watching her daughter grab at a napkin and crinkle it happily. I think I made a mistake, I said finally. A long mistake. A decades-long mistake. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You did the best you could with what you knew at the time. We all do. But that was the thing. I had known other things were possible, had just refused to see them. Robert had shown me kindness from day one, and I had rebuffed it as condescension. Marcus had offered companionship, and I had rejected it as a threat to my independence. My mother had tried to tell me you could have both, and I had dismissed her as brainwashed. All the data had been there, all the evidence that my framework was too rigid, too paranoid, too zero-sum. But I had clung to it because it made me feel righteous, made me feel like a warrior instead of just a person. The feminist ideology I had embraced wasn't wrong in its basic insights about inequality and injustice. But I had weaponized it, had used it as a shield against any vulnerability, any genuine connection, had told myself I was fighting patriarchy when really I was just fighting intimacy, because intimacy is scary, requires trust, requires letting someone see you as something other than competent and strong. Easier to say all men are oppressors than to risk loving one and being disappointed. Easier to say marriage is patriarchy than to do the hard work of building an equal partnership. Easier to stay alone and call it liberation than to admit I was afraid. Now I'm 63, and all my righteous positions feel like consolation prizes for a life I didn't actually want. I did break barriers, did achieve things, did prove that a woman could succeed without compromising. But I compromised anyway, just in different ways. Compromised connection for achievement, compromised love for independence, compromised human warmth for ideological purity. And the cruelest irony is that the men I spent my life defending against never actually took anything from me. I took it from myself. Robert became CFO and tried to give me a generous exit. Marcus moved on and found someone else to have dinner with. My colleagues respected my work even if they didn't particularly like me. The system was unfair in many ways, but I had made it more unfair to myself by refusing to work with anyone. Sitting here now, looking at the life I built, trying to decide if the feminist framework ruined me or if I ruined myself using feminism as a justification. Probably the second one, if I'm being honest. The ideas themselves weren't wrong, but I applied them in ways that were rigid and ultimately self-destructive. Used them to avoid the vulnerability required for genuine human connection. And now I'm alone, have been alone for most of my adult life, will probably die alone. The apartment is beautiful, the bank account is healthy, the career retrospective is impressive, but there's no one to share it with, no one who knows me beyond the armor, no one who has seen me weak and loved me anyway. My niece calls sometimes, asks how I'm doing, and I can hear the concern in her voice. She's building a different life, one that includes career and relationship and mess and compromise. And I'm genuinely happy for her, hope she succeeds in ways I didn't. But I also feel this deep sadness, this sense that I was sold a bill of goods, not by feminism itself, but by a particular interpretation of it that said strength meant isolation, independence meant refusing help, equality meant never needing anyone. Those ideas served me in some ways, protected me from some genuine threats in my early career, but I held on to them long after they were useful, long after they were protecting me from anything real, turned them into a cage and called it freedom. And now, I'm writing this at 63, trying to figure out what the moral of the story is. Maybe it's that ideology without nuance becomes poison. Maybe it's that you can be right about systemic problems, but wrong about individual solutions. Maybe it's that protecting yourself from everything means protecting yourself from the good things too. Or maybe there is no moral, maybe I just made choices and now I live with them. But I wish someone had told me, back when I was 22 and ready to fight the world, that you can stand up for yourself without standing alone, that you can be strong and still accept help, that you can fight inequality without treating every man as the enemy, that marriage and partnership and family aren't inherently oppressive, they're just human things that require work and trust. That my mother wasn't a victim, she was a person who made different choices than mine and found happiness in them. That Robert was just trying to be kind, Marcus just wanted company, David just wanted to be heard. That I could have had a career and a relationship, could have been successful and connected, could have fought for equality while still allowing myself to love and be loved. But I didn't believe any of that. Couldn't believe it without feeling like I was betraying something sacred. And now it's too late, or at least it feels too late. I'm not going to suddenly find a life partner at 63, Not going to build the deep friendships I should have cultivated decades ago. I'm not going to have children or grandchildren. Not going to have someone who remembers me as more than the difficult woman from the office. The victories I won feel hollow because there's no one to celebrate them with. The independence I fought for feels like loneliness. The strength I cultivated feels like brittleness. And I'm angry about it. Angry at the ideas that shaped me. Angry at myself for embracing them so thoroughly. Angry at the feminist theorists who made marriage sound like slavery and independence sound like salvation. Angry at the culture that presented such stark binaries, as if you had to choose between self and other, between achievement and connection. But mostly angry at myself for believing it all so completely, for never questioning whether there might be another way. I blamed feminism in the title of this piece, and there's some truth to that. Certain interpretations of feminism did give me frameworks that ultimately harmed me. But feminism didn't force me to be alone, didn't forbid me from accepting Robert's friendship, or Marcus's invitation, or my mother's wisdom. I did that myself, using feminist ideas as justification for choices that were really about fear. Fear of being diminished, fear of being controlled, fear of repeating my mother's life, fear of being vulnerable, of needing someone, of being disappointed, wrapped all that fear in ideology and called it principle. And now, I'm 63 years old, writing this on a Friday night, alone. The wine is good, the view is good, the apartment is good. But I would trade all of it, every achievement and every dollar, for someone to be here with me. Someone who knows me, who has seen me fail and succeed, who has history with me beyond professional accomplishments. Someone to cook dinner with, to watch movies with, to sit in comfortable silence with. Someone to care if I'm here or not. And that's the confession. That's what I need to say. Feminism didn't ruin my love life. I ruined my love life, and used feminism as the excuse. Took ideas that were meant to expand possibilities and used them to narrow my life to nothing but work and isolation. Mistook loneliness for independence. Mistook fear for strength. Mistook ideology for wisdom. And now I'm here, and this is what I have. And I can't go back and do it differently. Can't be 22 again and smile at Robert. Can't be 35 again and say yes to dinner with Marcus. Can't be 45 again and listen to David. Can't be 50 again and fight to keep my job. Can only be 63, alone, wondering how it all went so wrong, despite doing everything I thought was right. My niece is pregnant now, just found out, called to tell me yesterday. She was so happy, talking about how her husband cried when she told him, about their plans and hopes. And I was happy. For her, genuinely happy. But after I hung up, I cried for the first time in years. Cried for the life I didn't have, the choices I didn't make, the person I didn't become. Cried for the daughter I never had, who won't call me with news like that. Cried for the partner I never found, who won't cry with joy at becoming a father. Cried for all the moments I sacrificed on the altar of principle and achievement and fear. And I'm writing this because maybe someone else needs to hear it. Maybe some young woman out there is doing what I did, building walls instead of bridges, choosing isolation over vulnerability. Maybe she thinks she's being strong, thinks she's protecting herself, thinks she's winning. And maybe she needs to know what winning looks like from the other side. It looks like silence. It looks like an empty apartment on a Friday night. It looks like decades of achievements that no one celebrates with you. It looks like being right, but being alone. And if I could tell her anything, tell my younger self anything, it would be this. You can fight for equality without fighting against connection. You can be strong without being alone. You can protect yourself without closing yourself off from everything good. You can be a feminist and still want love, partnership, family. You can be successful and still need people. And needing people isn't weakness, it's being human. But I didn't learn that until it was too late. And that's why I'm here, 63 years old, writing a confession. Feminism didn't ruin my love life. I did. I just didn't realize it until there was no love life left to ruin.